what makes music sound like outer space. Like with previous environments, there is so much diversity in how space is commonly represented in an audio medium. I mean, after all, space can be a lot of things. Space could be flying between planets in a vibrant solar system. It could be cosmic horror and black hole spaghettification. It could be what my ex needed on October 13th, 2021. It could be incomprehensible alien planets and— wait, did you guys see that? As we've done for the other environments, let's sort our space music into largely arbitrary and non-mutually exclusive categories. Space music contains many aspects of the previous environments I've covered. The cold isolation of ice, the open floatiness of water. I guess it's not really shop though.
The one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism.
But anyways, space is interesting in that there isn't a real-world culture we can draw from, yet. The vast majority of the human race cannot relate by experience to being in space like they can with being cold, underwater, or paying $4 for a McChicken even though it was only $1.29 6 years ago. So starting with the most grounded of the three categories, we have tunes that attempt to mirror the physical qualities of space and how one might feel. As our current understanding of space in real life excludes the fantastic, like aliens and intergalactic warfare, space is kind of just big, cold ocean without the water. Much like water music, we can see a lot of ambience and weightlessness in space music, but this time due to the lack of gravity. One example of this kind of sound can be found in one of my personal favorites, Honeymoon Ridge from Mario Odyssey, the theme that plays when you're on the moon. We have these breathy, sine-wavy synths playing our block chords with a long release and reverb tail. Even the faster notes in the higher register have such long reverb that it's hard to distinguish the individual notes. It kind of just turns into one washy wall of sound, and to me maybe evokes the twinkling of distant stars. The harmony's similarly floaty, even our one chord doesn't hit a super solid C major. Our sus4 or 11, the F, muddies our chord just a bit and keeps it from feeling super grounded as our tonality. What I absolutely love about this tune though, and what makes it sound so spacey in my opinion, is this chord right here, the F sharp or sharp 4 chord in our key of C. It just sounds so stereotypically spacey, but why? I would argue it's mostly association. We've heard it used in culturally significant space music, and it kind of just keeps feeding into itself. But I'll talk about those examples a bit later. There is actually some pretty interesting music theory we can talk about regarding this chord. We can have relatively grounded tracks that capture the physical sensations of space, but the environment is almost inherently science fiction, both due to association, but also because we haven't been there. Composers can let their imagination run wild and capture a bit of the wonder and mystery, any sci-fi-ish elements like synths only adding to the distinction between space music and ocean music, for instance. And this sharp 4 chord sounds so sci-fi because it's the furthest removed chord from our tonality. The sharp 4 chord is the only major triad that is entirely non-diatonic. In other words, in C major, every single major chord we can possibly play uses at least one white key, except for F sharp major, using only black keys, none of which are present in C. You can perhaps justify the chord as modal interchange from Locrian, but in these cases I like to think of it as relative axis interchange. In our key of C major, our inverse vertex tonic is F sharp major, the reflection of our tonality. All of that is to say, how far removed the chord is from our tonality lends to its feeling of otherness and abstraction, which is used in so many space tracks, as we will soon see. I do think the specific usage in Honeymoon Ridge is pretty cool though. We get this G in the melody that has a bit of dissonant bite with this chord. And under this, we have a C pedal. The C stays in the bass while the chord changes to our sharp 4, really accentuating the contrast with the 1. We actually see this kind of pedal bass thing a lot in space music. To me at least, it evokes a kind of tether between the changing chords and unchanging bass, much like smaller celestial bodies orbiting a larger one. That exact imagery probably isn't intentional, but the pedal thing is a trend I've noticed. We can see something similar in the space station theme from Marble Saga Kororimpa. definitely less ambient with the funky bass and drums, but still maintains similar conventions to the Mario Odyssey track. We have that same tonic pedal, but this time going to the flat 6 chord, which works well enough in giving a bit of mystifying modal interchange sauce. The main melody contrasts from other elements in how long the phrasing is, and it's played on theremin, which is that classic sci-fi instrument which definitely evokes an old-school spacey kind of sound, due to its prominent usage in things like the Doctor Who theme or The Day the Earth Stood Still. Of course, one of the most beloved video game soundtracks of all time coincidentally is set almost entirely in space. Honestly, I could probably just fill up the entire video with examples from Mario Galaxy, but I'll be fair and keep it to one example per game. Okay fine, Mario Galaxy gets two. Starting with one of my personal favorites, Space Junk Road. We have this beautiful arpeggio on piano, both the long reverb tails and 3/4 time signature lending to the floatiness. The sound design on those light stabs in the synth is so perfect and iconic, light, theremin-esque, and quintessentially spacey. Despite not having a sharp 4 chord, we still utilize that sound in a more subdued way. We instead have just the sharp 4 scale degree, giving the tune a kind of Lydian flavor. The arpeggio in the intro immediately highlights our sharp 4 scale degree, D, and the melody comes in also emphasizing the same note. Just a touch of that sharp 4 sound, kind of a lesser degree of the jarringness we would otherwise hear if we had the entire sharp 4 chord. The harmony further develops, eventually giving us the classic Mario resolution with the flat 6, flat 7, 1 at the end. I'm really interested in this chord, however, the A flat over G flat. We're otherwise in Lydian up until this point. This chord could technically be thought of as modal interchange from Mixolydian, but it doesn't really give me that typically bluesy sound we would get from the 1 dominant 7. Instead, it really just feels like the bass moving independently from the chord, kind of an inversion of the pedal point thing we saw earlier. I like that touch of darkness we get from the bass walking down. That G-flat is rather unexpected and almost feels like it comes from the parallel minor. Even if it's not the intent, it just feels so subtly sinister, perhaps alluding to the upcoming boss. Every tune we've talked about thus far presents a rather optimistic view of space, the peacefulness of the isolation, the wonder of the floatiness. But we can also conceive of the dread of complete isolation in space, or perhaps the fear of not being alone. The floatiness can be fun, but being powerless, floating in a vacuum devoid of oxygen, or being subjected to gravity magnitudes stronger than you can conceive of is terrifying. Space is inherently whimsical and fantastic, but even without known aliens and intergalactic war, also inherently inhospitable and dangerous. A wonderfully tense theme can be heard in the original Metroid. The tune begins with this simple power chord bass and a tinny, echoing melody over top. It's super simple but very compositionally elegant in how it conveys that isolated space horror sound with just 3 voices and no sound design. It's a very subtle touch, but that bass dropping the low notes slightly early feels a bit unsettling, the effect to me almost sounding like a distress signal or alarm or something. The decaying melody is uncomfortable in how it kind of hangs around the flat 7 and flat 6 scale degrees, definitely establishing that darker minor sound, but also keeping a bit of ambiguous dissonance with the bass. It's so foreboding and a lovely title screen theme for this game where you're wandering alone through an unfamiliar, hostile alien planet. One final example of this kind of sound can be found in the title screen theme from a beloved 2010s space horror survival game, where you and the rest of the crew of a spaceship are dealing with a rogue alien aboard your craft, in hopes of jettisoning the creature into space, all while being picked off one by one. Among Us has a simple but perfectly fitting title screen theme. It's similar in tone to our Metroid example, but it does something pretty cool with the harmony. We do that pedal point 1 to sharp 4 thing we were talking about earlier, but this time it's sharp 4 to 1, assuming the pedal is the tonic. And both of the chords are minor this time, making it much of a darker sound. Especially with those shimmery, untimed dissonances in the second half, it's actually quite spooky. And yet it doesn't feel like it's played entirely straight. After all, Among Us is a children's party game. It's not that same kind of serious space horror you would get from something like Alien Isolation or even Metroid. That 1 to sharp 4 thing is fun in how it sounds spacey, but also perhaps due to its overuse in these kinds of things, feels a bit campy to me. Damn, I kind of want to play Among Us now, I'm not gonna lie.
Apparently it went bad, so...
Who wants to play Among Us? Dang it. But speaking of campiness, let's talk about our second category of space music, the military fanfares with funny sci-fi harmonies. As I've mentioned, we don't have a space culture to draw from in the same way we can draw from real-world cultures that live in the desert or ice, for instance. But that doesn't mean we don't have a cultural influence for space music. Rather, inarguably the most influential work when it comes to space fantasy, it should be no surprise that the Star Wars score is so iconic that it more or less stands as its own genre and sound. I'm not going to play it because of copyright, and besides, I'm sure you're already familiar with at least the main theme, but its influence cannot be overstated. In fact, as is the case with anything that is as iconic and has existed for as long as it has, it's almost hard to associate things that sound like Star Wars with the sincerity of the original. It's been supplanted by decades of parodies and references to the point that it's hard to shake the cheesiness of it all. Kind of similar to the situation with the 1 to sharp 4 thing. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Write something that sounds like Star Wars and you have a banger intergalactic space score that is still rather lighthearted. This works wonderfully in the title screen theme for Angry Birds Space. It's just so goofy. The orchestration and overall groove are different than our previous category. It's much bigger, and behind those brassy stabs we have this marching snare. Because after all, most of these tunes which emulate Star Wars are essentially writing a military march or an anthem with big brass sections and strings soaring over top. It works wonderfully in things that are like Star Wars, settings on a more intergalactic scale with themes of space imperialism, conquest, and warfare. These little freaks of nature are on site with the pigs, and are chasing them to the edge of the galaxy to pillage their structures and destroy porcine society in the name of retribution for their bloodline. But it's also not super serious. It is still Angry Birds after all. The harmony supports that humorous undertone by spamming the hell out of tritone relationships. This little intro adheres to the whole tone scale, mystifying in its own right, but also composed entirely of tritones, which we can see by isolating the pairs in the melody. After we resolve to our key of B-flat major, we soon get this flat 2 to 5 move, both of these roots also being a tritone apart. Though we never get an overt 1 to sharp 4 move, we end up modulating to the key of E major, which is also a tritone away from our original key of B-flat. Even in this later section where we tonicize F mixolydian, we can consider that F mixolydian is still a mode of B-flat. It's kind of an interesting thing. This wacky harmony is definitely a bit idiomatic to that romantic orchestral film score-y kind of sound we have in Star Wars, but it also still works on its own as alien and space-like because of just how uncommon and weird it is. Either way, fun as hell, and probably on the funnier end of Star Wars-ish music. Would have had a similar militaristic fanfare, but a bit more serious. I'm quite fond of the opening fanfare of StarCraft II Wings of Liberty's credits theme. It really leans into that sharp 4 sound in a bit of a different way. We have this interesting E-flat pedal in the bass, a common tone between the F7 and C-flat major chords. But also an F pedal in the high strings, which gives a slight crunch over the C-flat chord as the sharp 11. It's hard to say which of the two is the 1 and which is the sharp 4, but it doesn't really matter. All that matters is that we have that juicy tritone movement. But then after this, we kind of do the same thing up a half step. Most of the elements maintain that 1 to sharp 4 sound, going from G flat major to C major this time. The bass pedal notably flips in how it behaves under these new chords. The first time around, it was the flat 7 and then the third of the chord. This time, it acts as the third and then the flat 7. I really like this fanfare because it helps to establish that Space Marine quality to the Terran army, shortly before we go into a more unplaceably Earth-like minor key anthem. It sounds like the NFL theme, but if they couldn't field enough players without building more supply depots.
Additional supply depots required.
Okay, but anyways, this kind of sound isn't entirely defined by bombastic fanfares. We can also convey a warlike sound through staccato processionals. The Star Fox 64 intro presents a more subdued military-style march. It's definitely more orchestrationally simple, harmonized horns and strings playing in rhythmic unison all over this marching snare. I personally wouldn't say it's especially spacey, but this B section where we modulate to this almost C Phrygian dominant is so striking and serious. That flat 2 chord definitely pulls us to a different place that I can concede as being space-like, almost like a lesser version of the sharp 4. It of course works well in our space fleet kind of setting. The game features the Star Fox crew engaging in interplanetary war with the monkey. Let's take this slow and deliberate march sound and once again turn it darker. We can hear this in Mario Galaxy's Battle Rock Galaxy. We're immediately greeted by this intense ostinato played by staccato strings. We've already talked a bit about the influence of Star Wars on space music, but many would argue Star Wars itself was directly influenced by the true progenitor of the space orchestral sound, Gustav Holst's The Planets suite. Perhaps the most well-known movement in the suite, you'll immediately notice many similarities with Battle Rock Galaxy, Star Wars, and other space bangers. The iconic 5/4 opening ostinato in Mars is very similar to the one we have in Battle Rock. Notice also the emphasis on the sharp 4 scale degree, all over our unmoving tonic pedal. We even get the entire sharp 4 chord over the G pedal here. Even that rhythm, which alternates between triplet and duplet, is so commonly echoed in our standard space fare, and at least to me helps to immediately rhythmically distinguish the space march sound from a more earthly one. There's honestly so much more I can talk about with the planets, but it's a bit outside of the scope of this video, and there's a few other videos that have done some great analyses already. It's impossible to fully convey the influence not only Mars, but the other planets, especially Jupiter, have had on the space orchestral sound. I would highly recommend listening to the full planet suite after the video if you haven't already. You'll honestly be surprised how familiar it sounds. Okay, but pivoting back to Battle Rock Galaxy, we have our Mars-ish ostinato, but also another ostinato over this in the synth. This is low-key one of my favorite elements of the entire Mario Galaxy soundtrack. The ostinato over the E and B in the bass gives such a bright sound, kind of major-ish or Dorian-ish with the F sharp and C sharp. It is contrasted immediately by the darkness of the following F and C in the bass, which by itself implies modal interchange from Phrygian, but check out what our upper synth is doing. We maintain that exact same E major-ish ostinato over this new F chord, which gives such an insane dissonance and sense of hyper-brightness. There's the very subtle touch of changing the ostinato at the end of this as well, introducing this A sharp which implies an E Lydian-ish ostinato over our otherwise Phrygian sound. Extreme brightness over extreme darkness. It's just such a weird and counterintuitive compositional choice, it honestly looks awful on paper. But this stark contrast and almost polymodal sound makes the tune so magical for me, and it is still thematically appropriate. It's kind of the inverse of our pedal point precedent. Rather than having things in the upper structure change over an unmoving bass line, we have the bass line changing over an unmoving upper structure. Super cool. We continue with the more standard Phrygian dominant thing like Star Fox, the ostinato now changing to match the harmony. It does slip back into that static ostinato thing again for the second phrase though, which is still so cool. In context, the music being a direct reference to Mars is fitting in more ways than one. Obviously both are space related, but consider that Mars's full title is Mars the Bringer of War, a reference to the Roman god of the same name. Battle Rock Galaxy is a departure from the otherwise more fantastical Bing Bing Wahoo style of galaxies in the game, instead sporting walls of heavy artillery and other futuristic defenses throughout the level. Which leaves us with our final category of space music. Things in this category tend to be about larger scale cosmic phenomena, black holes, supernovae, and the scale of the universe. The subjects tend to be more existential and abstract, versus the prior focus on trivial human concepts like coldness, war, and little green men. In terms of the music theory, our chord progressions actually tend to be more diatonic and simple. In fact, all three of the examples you're going to see pretty much have the exact same chord progression. We see fast and sweeping arpeggios, flying past us like worlds revolving around larger celestial bodies at speeds magnitudes higher than we can conceive. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's take a listen to Aurelion Sol's theme from League of Legends. So cool, we have this string and synth ostinato that slowly builds in intensity over the course of the form. We have this powerful bass underneath, giving a firm foundation for our chord progression, which is mostly a simple 1 minor, flat 7, flat 6. This repeats twice, but our third phrase subverts this with the unexpected 6-7 or sub 5 of flat 6, which then pulls us into our flat 6. It's such a magical chord, which makes a lot of sense. We're in C sharp minor, but in our relative major of E major, the A sharp chord is just our familiar sharp 4. I also love the dichotomy between our slow and deliberate melody and fast string ostinato. The strings are playing non-nuplets, or 9 notes in the span of each quarter note. It's so swirling and hard to keep track of the beat until the melody comes in, giving a sense of macro scale to the phrase, while the ostinato turns into a sea of indiscrete complexity within. It feels like a mirror of the grander cosmos, such large-scale events taking place while innumerable smaller trivialities happen within. Which is of course a wonderful theme for Aurelion Sol. In the lore, Bro is pretty much a force of nature, this godlike creature that exists on the universal scale, weaving galaxies together while petty warring factions squabble beneath him in Runeterra. I would appreciate the theme a lot more if the A-Souls on my team would stop inting, but you know, we can't win them all.
I can see you.
It's hard to really prove, but I'm convinced this modern trailery space sound is heavily inspired by Hans Zimmer's Interstellar soundtrack. That iconic main theme features a simple repeating melody, with fast arpeggios flying around it. Not entirely necessary to talk about in great detail, but I'm convinced that Hans Zimmer was directly influenced by the GOAT Philip Glass, particularly his work on Glassworks. Many have noted the compositional similarities between opening and the Interstellar theme, and especially with Glass's fondness for organ ostinatos as a texture, it wouldn't surprise me if this was a primary influence for Hans. Also, if you haven't listened to the minimalist masterpiece that is Einstein on the Beach, I would highly recommend checking that out as well. But anyways, another tune in line with this sound was brought to my attention by one of you guys. Control's Wishes from the mobile game Arknights. So powerful. We start with a sweeping melody in the high strings, while we have this falling, dovetailing ostinato in these FM synths. This continues into this transitional bit where we have this countdown from 10, obviously very evocative of a spaceship launch. In fact, this is sampled directly from the real-life Voyager 1 countdown, which is probably the most direct and elegant solution to making something sound like space. Just sample one of the few things modern humanity has that is inseparably associated with space exploration. This section builds into a climactic chorus, where we have our sweeping string melody in octaves over epic low brass. It more or less adheres to the same chord progression we saw earlier, but I do like how the subversion this time is that we climb up from the flat 6, and then hit that super cathartic major tonic. It just fills me with such a strong sense of hope and the human spirit, our primal urge to explore and understand that which is bigger than ourselves. I haven't played Arknights, so I don't fully grasp the context of this tune, but from what I understand, it's the theme of the eponymous Control, who yearns to be the first person to leave the planet and explore the greater universe. Amazing theme that works wonderfully to capture that feeling. But of course, we can't talk about space music without talking about the absolute masterful soundtrack of Outer Wilds. Per the nature of the game, talking about pretty much anything constitutes a spoiler of some variety, so I swear I'll keep it as spoiler-free as I possibly can. I will talk very vaguely about the context of the music, and I won't show any gameplay. Okay, so let's take a listen to Final Voyage. Really, much of the beauty in this track is in the simplicity. It doesn't have any non-diatonicism or funny chords. The melody, bass, and lower ostinato never really change, and much of the build of the tune comes from adding more textures and synths, such as this falling ostinato. The spaciness is rather mild, coming from our synths, which contrast with the more real acoustic instruments heard in more grounded parts of the game. But it's perfect for what it is and where it takes place. The tune is simultaneously so somber yet striving. It starts as a whisper, and like many other tunes in this category, conveys such a sense of grand scale by giving us this big reverby wall of sound. It's the perfect underscore for this climactic moment, a monumental decision of cosmic scale, perhaps the most important decision in the universe. The slow building of sound that compounds on itself seems to echo the game's themes of growth and building atop prior discoveries. I would be remiss to not also mention the meta context of this tune. It's a remix of sorts of another track in the game, and if you've played it, you can see how recontextualizing that theme to play during this part is so cool, and further adds to the seriousness and importance of this moment. I'll probably do a full Outer Wilds video at some point, so I'll save some of my more tangential thoughts for then. But either way, amazing soundtrack and wonderful capstone to the grand cosmic category of space bangers. And that's pretty much it. As is the case for all of these environment videos, this is by no means a comprehensive list of all of the ways you can write your own space-themed bangers, so if I missed your favorites, post them in the comments. There are always iconic exceptions to these groups, but hopefully this was enough to categorize the bigger trends and give you guys some cool ideas. If you liked this video, consider supporting me on Patreon, smash that like button, hit that bell, and okay, seriously, what is that?